My name is Tom Harris, and this is Exploratory Journeys. In this new program, I will be taking you on a weekly journey of exploration into many of the world's most fascinating and important topics. That would include space exploration, human futures, environment, artificial intelligence, energy, even policing, and new methods in public speaking and singing. I'll even play a little bit of guitar. It'll be great fun, and I hope you will join me each week as I bring in some of the most amazing guests on these topics. Already, I have commitments from experts in energy and environment, artificial intelligence, space exploration, public speaking, singing, and policing to be interviewed on my show. But first, who am I? As I said, my name is Tom Harris, born in Montreal to Mary and Ted Harris. I have three sisters, Jennifer, Lucinda, and Margot, all of whom live in the Ottawa area now. We all moved here bit by bit over time as Quebec became less friendly, let's say, towards the Anglo population. However, it's still a wonderful place to visit, and we have lots of friends there. I've been married since 1983, and I have two daughters in their mid-20s. Growing up in Montreal, my passions were hockey. I mean, who could live in Montreal and not have hockey as a passion? Space exploration, of course, because Apollo 11 was landing on the moon when I was 16. Basketball, Wilt Chamberlain, and of course, guitar. I went to Carleton University in 1971 and spent 15 years in aerospace engineering after my master's at McMaster and about 7 years in high technology. After the JDS Uniphase reduction, let's say, I had a fairly reasonable severance pay, and my wife said, well, why don't you do what you want instead of what you are doing? And so I thought, well, I love communicating science. And so I got a job with Bob Mills, who was the opposition senior environment critic for the Canadian Alliance in the House of Commons. And my job was legislative assistant and communications. So that's what I started in 2002. And I've been in that field ever since, working for PR firms and now working on my own for my own company in communications and science. However, my love has always been the space program. And it really started with the 1986 Challenger accident. That's where I started to take a greater interest in communications and the space program. And the reason for that was very simple. CBC and many media, especially in the United States, were criticizing NASA for not launching the shuttle under all sorts of really dangerous conditions, very cold weather, for example. They were comparing it with the Ariane unmanned rocket. So I called CBC and spoke to their producer and said, look, you can't launch under the same conditions when you have a manned vehicle versus an unmanned one. It's not fair to push them to launch under those conditions. It's not safe. And in fact, what happened is a lot of media push on NASA. The engineers said in January of 1986, don't launch. It's too cold. We don't know the operational specifics at these kinds of temperatures. But the NASA engineers were overruled. And in fact, yielding to media and other pressure, they launched. And of course, the O-rings leaked at that low temperature, and it led to the Challenger disaster. Now, you might recall that shortly afterwards, the media were dumping on NASA for launching under those conditions. So I called the CBC back and I said, what are you doing? You just totally changed sides just to criticize NASA. And they had no patience with that whatsoever. And I realized at that point that I couldn't stay on the sidelines any longer. I had to get involved in communications and actually telling the public about what science really says about all kinds of issues, including global warming, not, and of course, space exploration. Now, my true love, as I say, is space. And in fact, in next week's next week's session, we'll be having a fellow by the name of Dr. Robert Zubrin, an aerospace engineer. I believe he's from Colorado. He's author of the 1996 book, The Case for Mars. He was one of the driving forces behind Mars Direct, a 1990 proposal to produce significant reductions in the cost and complexity of sending people to Mars. And here's what it says in Wikipedia about Dr. Zubrin. As I say, Robert Zubrin will be on the show next week. That's Wednesday next week. From Wikipedia, it says, the idea of his Mars Direct was to use the Martian atmosphere to produce oxygen, water, and rocket propellant for the surface, and they would stay, actually, on Mars and produce the materials they needed right there. Now, Robert Zubrin is quite interesting because, as it says here, he questions the delay and cost-to-benefit ratio of first establishing moon bases or asteroid bases, and he says that neither would be able, this is what Wikipedia says, neither would be able to provide all its own oxygen, water, or energy. These resources are producible on Mars, and he expects people would be there, should be going there first. And that's why he established the Mars Society in 1998. The next week, I'll be having Dr. Sterling Burnett. He's from the Heartland Institute out of Arlington Heights, Illinois. He's a senior fellow on environmental policy, and he's managing editor of the Environment and Climate News. Now, he's going to be a very interesting guest because he is very candid. While he's a supporter of Trump in general terms, he is not supportive of the current approach to climate change. Okay, because it's in many ways it's like Obama light. It's just a lesser version trying to reduce carbon dioxide. And so Sterling is going to be very candid about what should be done in the United States. We should re-examine the whole idea that carbon dioxide is something that needs to be controlled. The next week, July 17th, Robert Lyman. He's from the Ottawa-based Energy Policy Consultant Group. He's the principal at NTRANS Policy Research Incorporated. He spent 27 years in the Canadian Public Service as a diplomat, economist, and policy advisor, and, just lots and lots of experience. And Robert is going to talk about things like the true cost of the carbon tax in Canada and whether it's worth doing in any way. So he's on Wednesday, July 17th. Other guests we have committed to coming on the program over the summer. First one is Al Tassi, a former RCMP undercover drug officer. And besides policing, he has fascinating stories about growing up in the Depression. So that's going to be a very interesting show. Mr. Tassi is an amazing character. Next, we'll have Nicolas Lapierre. He's the current president of the Constellation Toastmasters Club, and he's an expert in something a little different to leadership. He's an expert in followership, and so we're going to learn about that. The third person that we're going to be bringing in over the summer is Meredith Matthews. She's Ottawa's only Estelle voice coach. On her Facebook page, she says this: "Did you know that the science of voice tells you that you can sing, and indeed everyone has a beautiful voice? You just have to find it." As a skilled trainer and professional performer, Meredith Matthews helps speakers, business professionals, and singers wanting to perfect their instrument. Anyone who wants to have good speaking voice, be able to have convincing speeches and also excellent singing, well, you got to talk to her. And she'll be coming in, as I say, later in the summer. Following that, David Long, president of Sage TV, an artificial intelligence company here in Ottawa. I had a great talk with him today about AI and the fact that many of our ideas from 2001: A Space Odyssey, those things are already coming true. So David Long's going to be coming in later in the summer. That's a rundown of the kind of things that we're going to be exploring in our program, Exploratory Journeys. I think it should be great fun. I love to look at alternative points of view, and we're going to hear lots of those in this show. So Nick is right beside me. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm doing fine, Tom. You're off to a great start.
Yeah, well, it's very exciting. Getting all these experts, it gives me an excuse to talk to them, and they're answering my emails. It's wonderful.
Yes, that's sometimes the hardest part. And from my own experience, when you tell somebody that you're giving them a platform to explain their point of view, they're usually pretty eager to take you up on it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And having podcasts after the programs mean we can send it all over the universe.
And they get a chance to listen to it afterwards, and they can send it out through their networks.
That's right. And people like Nicolas Lapierre, for example, he's trying to get speaking engagements on followership. And that'll be interesting for him to share. Why is that important in today's world? We can't all be leaders and being an effective follower, but not being a serf. I mean, there's a balance there, and it's an interesting topic.
So, Tom, let me ask you, the idea of having a podcast and doing a podcast, because you're obviously a very dynamic person. You're used to talking to crowds. You're used to voicing an alternative opinion from the climate point of view. What was it about the idea of a podcast that you found most appealing? And did it is it something that was brewing in the back of your mind for a while, or is it something that when the opportunity presented itself, you just jumped on it?
I think the latter. That, in fact, I've always been interested in communicating alternative points of view. This sounded like a great way to do it, to actually get the actual experts on air with me, not just me saying in newspaper articles like I've done for the last 30 years, Joe Blow says such and such, but actually have the experts sitting right there. Dr. Zubrin. I mean, that's going to be amazing.
So you'll let him speak for himself and let people take away from it what they want to out of what he said.
Yeah, and if he's willing, we'll take calls from the public. I mean, to talk directly to people like him, that's pretty amazing. And, you know, as I say, my impetus to do this was my annoyance over the media coverage of the Space Shuttle Challenger incident. But later, it also expanded into global warming. I mean, I used to be generally on the side of Suzuki on the issue. I wasn't really focused hard on it, but I would assume that, in fact, it was right. And I wrote an article on comparative planetology that was published in the Ottawa Citizen, talking about how exploring the planets allows us to better understand our world.
Yep.
And one of the examples I used was the greenhouse effect on Venus and how it could, you know, be an analogy to what could happen on the Earth if we weren't careful. Well, Professor Patterson from Carleton University, he liked the article so much that he used it in his geology course. However, he told his students, but this part about greenhouse gases is wrong. What happened on Venus cannot happen on the Earth. And that's something we can explore in detail later as to why it is the case. But he invited me to his lab, and he showed me the geologic record of CO2 and temperature. And there's no correlation. Okay, now this is the real Earth. This is not computer simulations. And I thought at first, you know, who's this guy? He must be like a right-wing oil-funded denier. Well, no, not at all, actually. He was a bearded bicycling person who just adopted a baby from China and, you know, did not fit the stereotype at all. And so he very intelligent man, a PhD from UCLA, if you can imagine that. I mean, that's the, you know, the home of the Bruins. But, yeah, so he introduced me to many people across the spectrum in this area and showed that the climate scare is ridiculous. I mean, there is no actual evidence in the real world data to support this. And so I asked him, would you write with me? Would you actually be a co-author with me to try and tell the world about this? And this is something we're going to do with Sterling Burnett and with other people, Jay Lear, Dr. Lear, who's our senior policy analyst. We're going to talk a lot about this because, you know, right now, over $1 billion a day is being spent on climate finance around the world. Okay. And they're saying we're going to be wasting trillions of dollars every year across the world, if in fact this isn't stopped. This is like easily, as Tim Ball says, it's the greatest hoax in the history of science. Okay. It's an enormous scandal. And that is one of the main things I want to do with this show, is expose scandals. That is a big, big scandal.
It's hard to imagine one larger.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, there was one point where the climate finance field was growing so fast, they said it was going to pass armaments as the world's leading industry. Okay? And, you know, this was based on computer models because there's nothing in the real physical data to support the idea that we're causing dangerous climate change. It's just simply computer models. And so that was when I said to Dr. Patterson, we have to tell everybody. And in those days, in the year 2000, 1999, Ottawa Citizen, Winnipeg Free Press, Vancouver Sun, they would all publish the articles that we would send out. And so at the very beginning, we had great success. It was really quite exciting. And we had, you know, the opportunity to tell a lot of people, get on radio, all sorts of things. Now, of course, media generally across the spectrum, especially in Canada, have almost totally closed ranks behind Suzuki and the climate scare. So it's much more difficult now. But that was also another thing that made me realize you can have these scientists doing all that research in the lab, but if people don't hear about it, it has no impact on public policy. And later on, when I worked for the Canadian Alliance for about 7 months, what I realized was that they paid far more attention to the newspaper and what was in the media than they paid any attention to what was in the real science. And so once again, it told me, I've got to get into public relations and communications. And fortunately, after being in the House of Commons for 7 months, I got offered a job with APCO Worldwide. They're based in Washington. They're a great group. They're around the world, and they were opening an Ottawa office. And they brought me in to work in aerospace. But wouldn't you know, they got contracts not in aerospace, but on things to do with energy and environment. So I ended up doing a lot of work with them for about 4 years. And so overall, I've moved from being a pure technocrat to being a technical and science communicator, and it's great. I love it.
Well, obviously you have a great passion for it. And that's the kind of thing that is lacking in a lot of debates when it comes to climate science. And, well, in science in general, when people discuss whether it be climate or whether it be euthanasia, or you pick the scientific discussion, there's always, or the new technologies around transportation is another one, like electric cars. Frankly, I wouldn't own an electric car if you gave it to me. I'd sell the battery for scrap and sell the wheels. I mean, I'm just not interested in them. Partly because I've got this, what they call in the equine world, it's called opposition reflex. You tell me to do something, I'm going to push back.
Yeah.
Ask me to do something, that's different.
Mm-hmm.
But if you tell me, like for years I wouldn't wear my seatbelt. Simply because the government didn't even ask. They just mandated. It's why I don't like metric. Because they simply said, you will. I said, like hell I will.
Yeah. Well, in many ways, I'm very similar. I mean, I hate being told what the truth is.
Yeah.
And of course, as we were discussing the other day, the whole concept of truth in science, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Truth is something that is universal, necessary, and certain. Okay.
Yes.
Something like how you move pieces on a chessboard. And that's truth because we made up the rules. But things like science, I mean, that's just our interpretation of how we observe nature. So a lot of this inconvenient truth stuff, it doesn't even make sense in concept, let alone being wrong scientifically. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, the thing that I remember, if I've done a little bit of reading about some of the guys like Louis Pasteur and some of the different very early scientists, what's his name, the apple on his head? Was it Benjamin? Newton. Isaac Newton. You know, there were no rules. They were writing the rules as they went along, let me take that back. There were rules, but they didn't know what they were. Mm-hmm. And they had to discover them through experimentation. That's the whole backbone of science, if I understand the scientific method correctly.
That is something, we'll probably try and get in Professor Goldman from Lehigh University to talk about this, because there are actually different approaches to science. For example, Sir Francis Bacon felt that science should be, like you say, based on experimentation. And he talked about the idols of the mind. Okay, in other words, our interpretations are influenced by our schooling, by our upbringing, by our culture, by our own natural tendencies. One of them, for example, is called the idol of the tribe, which is a standard that, in fact, applies to all humans. Humans tend to see patterns in nature that aren't really there. Okay, we try to assimilate. Obviously we see patterns in the clouds. Right. But one of the points he made is that many of the patterns we see are fulfilling our own predetermined bias. Okay, so a person who believes that man-made global warming is super dangerous is going to see all kinds of correlations between CO2 and temperature.
Exactly.
Because that's one of the idols of the tribe. And, that kind of thing is what we should be talking to Goldman about, because there's a totally different approach that came as a result of Descartes. Descartes said that we are born with an innate understanding of truth. If you can believe that, okay?
Yeah.
He said we didn't need experimentation at all. All we needed to do was somehow plumb the depths of our brain, and we would know that. Now, it's interesting because I don't think either side is completely right. I think there are some absolutes that we generally understand because we are humans, because of our evolution. But I think also experimentation is pretty darn important, and how you interpret it is pretty important as well. So that's a topic I think we should explore a lot more, because it led to what was called the science wars in the late 1990s. In fact, Professor Goldman did a whole course called the science wars. You see, physical scientists being like physicists and chemists, were saying they were uncovering truth about nature. And that these social scientists, it was all fluffy stuff, okay? It was not truth at all. And it was just very squishy. And the social scientists being people like sociologists and anthropologists, well, they said, no, you are also only exposing your opinions based on your observations and your interpretations. You're not actually exercising truth determination either. And so they had quite a war, and it was really pretty bitter at times.
Well, that's going to be an interesting conversation,
yeah,
to put it mildly. I want to go back to one comment you made about truth and how we just seem to know that. In other quarters, we call that natural law. Mm-hmm. In the legal profession, as an example. They used to teach it. They don't anymore. And I think it's a big problem because my argument is it's always been morally wrong to kill someone just because you don't like the shirt they're wearing that day.
Yeah, I think you can say that.
That is what's called an eternal truth. That doesn't change no matter the era, no matter the circumstance. You can't kill somebody in cold blood, just because. That's always wrong. That doesn't mean that the taking of human life is always wrong, but there are some very specific boundaries around that. Mm-hmm. But to take somebody's life just because they happen to be the next person around the corner is always morally wrong.
Yeah, now Goldman, being a philosopher, he's a retired philosophy professor, he'll be fun to talk to about those kinds of things, because I think he would almost certainly agree with you that there are some absolute truths, not in science, but in various other ways.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying too.
Yeah, my show isn't always going to be serious. I mean, about things like that. Well, we're going to talk about, actually it's a serious thing, but it's going to be a lot of fun, and that is these new Estelle methods of voice production. Okay, they're pretty amazing. We're going to have Meredith Matthews come in. She's agreed to come in and actually come to the studio here and do some demonstrations as to how you can, with very little air, make beautiful sound, either speaking or singing, and how anybody can massively improve their speaking voice by training various muscles to tighten up so that little air has to go between your vocal cords. If your vocal cords are only held by loose and slack muscles, lots of air goes through and you get pretty crummy sound. Very breathy, and you run out of air really quick.
Yep.
If you follow the Estelle method that I'm learning from her, and she'll undoubtedly talk about, you can make great sound with very little effort, and you don't need to breathe anywhere near as much. So those are going to be fun topics because it applies to anybody who's trying to convince anyone of anything or just simply great singing.
Hey, you know what? There's more to singing than just around the campfire. My mother sang for the Hamilton Light Opera when I was very small.
Whoa, is that right?
And, that woman could sing. My dad couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. It was just, he was tone deaf.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it was an annual event or a one-time deal, but he got up on the table at New Year's Eve, and there might have been a little bit of alcohol involved, but Dad was never a big drinker. And he did Jingle Bells at the top of his voice.
That must have been fun.
I think somebody paid him to get him down because he was that bad. So we've got both sides of the coin on within our family.
Well, that's partly why your voice is good. I guess you've heard good voicing growing up. Well, Meredith was an opera singer as well.
I have an average voice, and there's millions of people better than I am, and there's millions of people who on the other side of the scale. My kids can sing. Holy crap. But that's a different story. Anyway, singing, I think, but you hit on something because there's more to singing than just the enjoyment of it. It's a whole cultural thing.
Oh, it's a science thing, too.
Yes, but look at the way we used to tell stories. Mm-hmm. When before the written word, music and the rhythms that went with it were how you passed your culture on. Mm-hmm. Look at the native populations.
Well, look at that song by, let's see, it's written by Jordan Kerr, the astrophysicist, and it's sung by Carvin.
Is that the one?
Yeah, Fire in the Sky.
Fire in the Sky.
I mean, that is so dramatic. It tells the story of the space program, and it's just amazing. I mean, I played it to Meredith, and she said it brought tears to her eyes.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, Buzz Aldrin was played that song at a space conference, and when they got to the part where the Challenger is destroyed, he cried, So, I mean, if you're trying to convince people of certain things, this is a useful tool. I'm starting to use it more in my presentations.
As a matter of fact, music, I think, speaks to the human heart far more effectively than the spoken word does.
Totally, yeah.
There's a story. Let me ask you this question. You may know the answer. What is the most sung song in history?
Good question. I don't know. What is it?
Amazing Grace.
Okay.
It's sung somewhere between 5 and 10 million times a day.
Wow.
Around the world.
Yeah, it was.
Okay, so in other words, it carries a very powerful message that people identify with.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the people that I like to listen to is an old country western guy called Don Williams. He's since passed away, but has a voice like velvet, and his specialty was ballads.
Wow.
Like he did one called "What Do You Do with Good Old Boys Like Me?" He talks about growing up in the Deep South with Wolfman Jack as a DJ.
Yeah.
And how the Tennessee, the Williams boys, Tennessee Williams and Ernie and that whole crowd meant so much to him. And his relationship with his father and things like that. There's a lot of relatable elements in it.
Oh, yeah.
So these kinds of stories, I think, are going to be fascinating to explore.
Well, also, if we're saying that the real reasons for the human expansion into space are not the spin-offs and the jobs and wealth creation.
That's part of it.
Well, they're benefits, but as Charles Laughlin says, and I'm trying to get him on for an interview, and that would be awesome. He's in Arizona. But he's an anthropologist, and he says that even if none of those benefits existed, we should still be doing it, because it has to do with human nature and the way we will change as we move into new frontiers. Now, if you're going to talk about social science and these kinds of exciting developments as to changes for humanity, then, yeah, using music makes sense. I mean, it touches your heart, because that's what this is about. It's not just the head. It's the heart.
When the two work in tandem.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you can be inspired to tears by Winston Churchill's "We Will Never Surrender." But there is nothing as moving at different times than, say, Last Post or the national anthem.
Oh, yeah.
During times of great jubilation or great mourning, things like that. There's one song I heard at a funeral one time. It's a very old Irish piece called Parting Glass. And it talks about a guy getting up and leaving.
Yeah.
And having that last drink with his friends before he goes. Well, I won't call it a dirge, but you could have written it for a funeral. But it's not something that makes you just, it crushes you. There's hope in it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the things we're going to learn from Meredith is that the way you see the voice quality, how you can have a different frequency spectrum for your voice for different kinds of emotions.
Right.
I mean, this is really important. If you're trying to convince anybody of anything, you've got to say things in a way that sound genuine, that sound emotional, that actually identify with what you're trying to say. Yeah. And this is something that so few politicians and other people use in their speeches. We've got to learn it, and we'll learn it from her and others.
I have no doubt about it. And it's music has been a big part of our lives in my home, and obviously in part of yours as well. So we look forward to all the shows, that's for sure. It sounds like you got yourself quite a great list so far.
Yeah.
People to join you, and I wish you all the best and the best of success with your podcast.
Okay, well, it's going to be fun. Thank you for inviting me to do it.
Yeah, the pleasure is ours.